I don't care how you do it, just make sure the deal goes through tonight. If they find out what we did, we are ruined. I don't care how you do it, just make sure she doesn't testify. If the information leaks, we're finished.
In the mansion of CEO Min Jae, silence isn't just a courtesy, it's a requirement. But a single whisper can bring down an empire faster than 1,000 bullets. While the most powerful man in the city sat behind a grand mahogany desk, draped in luxury and gold, he believed his secrets were locked behind soundproof glass. He was wrong. In the shadows of the doorway, a woman whose name he barely bothered to remember stood frozen. Jada Whitmore, a nobody in a Navy uniform meant to blend into the walls, wasn't looking for trouble. She was just doing her job. But as the boss's face paled and his grip tightened on the phone, the words he heard didn't just expose a betrayal. They lit a fuse that would freeze the heart of the mansion by midnight. She didn't stay because she owed him. She didn't stay for the wealth that lined his pockets. She stayed because integrity isn't measured by the title you hold, but by what you're willing to risk when the world turns cold. Tonight, CEO Min Jae is about to learn that while he owns the house, the invisible woman in the hallway is the only one who knows how to save his life. If this introduction kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because next week we're uncovering a story about a disgraced heiress and the silent bodyguard who took a bullet for her secrets. The CEO mansion didn't breathe. It ticked like a grandfather clock, precise and indifferent. In the world of CEO Min Jae, perfection was the only acceptable currency, and for Jada Whitmore, the cost of that perfection was her voice. As she moved through the vast, marble-clad hallways of the estate, she wasn't a person. She was a ghost in a navy and white uniform, a silent shadow tasked with erasing every trace of human existence before the master of the house could see it. The rules of silence were unwritten but absolute. You did not speak unless spoken to. You did not make eye contact. You did not let the soles of your shoes squeak against the polished obsidian floors. Jada had mastered the art of the invisible life. She knew the exact angle to tilt her head to remain unnoticed, the exact rhythm of breathing that wouldn't disturb the air as Min Jae walked past, smelling of expensive sandalwood and cold iron. Her morning began at 4 a.m., a ritual of steam and starch. She polished the silver until it reflected her tired, dark eyes, eyes that had learned to see everything while appearing to see nothing. She moved through the grand dining hall, where the air was always 5 degrees colder than the rest of the city, a testament to the icy temperament of the man who sat at the head of the table. To the rest of the world, CEO Min Jae was a titan of industry, a man of unfathomable wealth. To Jada, he was a series of sharp edges, the razor crease of his charcoal suit, the rhythmic tapping of a gold signet ring against a mahogany desk, and the terrifying weight of his silence. She spent her hours buffing away the fingerprints of men who dealt in blood and shadows, her hands moving in practiced circles. There was a strange safety in the invisibility. As long as she stayed a ghost, the violence of Min Jae's world couldn't touch her. She was just the girl who cleared the espresso cups and straightened the silk curtains, a part of the furniture as vital and as overlooked as the foundation stones of the mansion itself. But even a ghost has ears, and in a house built on secrets, being invisible meant you were the only one who truly saw the cracks forming in the glass. Jada didn't want to know what happened behind the heavy oak doors of the study, but as she knelt to polish the brass threshold, the silence of the mansion suddenly broke. For the first time in 3 years, the clock stopped ticking, and the ghost in the uniform heard a sound that didn't belong, the sharp, panicked intake of a powerful man's breath. The brass threshold was cold beneath Jada's fingertips, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in her chest. She should have moved on. The hallway was a corridor of silence, and any deviation from her route was a gamble with her livelihood. But the door to the study wasn't clicked shut. It was ajar by a mere fraction of an inch, a hairline fracture in the mansion's perfect facade. From within, the low, melodic rumble of C.O. Min-jae's voice drifted out, but the melody was broken. Gone was the steady, terrifying composure of the man who ruled the city. Instead, there was a jagged edge of disbelief. Jada remained frozen in a half-kneeling position, her polishing cloth gripped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She knew the rules. A ghost does not listen. A ghost does not exist. Yet, the desperation in his tone acted like a magnet, pulling her closer to the sliver of light spilling onto the carpet. Tonight, Min-jae's voice was a harsh whisper, vibrating with a rare, raw vulnerability. The dots were supposed to be secure. Who gave the order? The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the muffled, frantic response from the other end of the line. Jada leaned an inch forward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The elite squad. Min-jae continued, and Jada could almost hear the ice forming in his lungs. They aren't coming for the shipment. They're coming for the house. My own lieutenants, they've opened the gates. The words hit Jada like a physical blow. Aku, the inner circle, the men she served tea to and whose bloodied shirts she laundered, were turning the mansion into a tomb. The phone call revealed the brutal mechanics of the betrayal. The security feeds would be looped at 11:59 p.m., the silent alarms deactivated, and the perimeter guards had already been paid to look the other way. By midnight, the man behind the desk would be a memory, and anyone left inside would be collateral damage. Jada's breath hitched, a tiny, soft sound that felt like a scream in the stillness of the hallway. Inside the room, the sliding of a heavy leather chair signaled Min-jae's sudden movement. She saw his shadow stretch across the floor toward the door. Panic surged through her, the instinct to run, to vanish into the servant quarters and pray for dawn. But as she looked at the sliver of his panicked face through the gap, she saw not a monster, but a man who had been utterly abandoned. The mansion was no longer a fortress. It was a cage, and Jada was the only one who knew the lock had already been turned. The door creaked, a treacherous groan of wood and hinge that cut through the silence of the study like a gunshot. Jada didn't have time to retreat. The gap widened, and suddenly the invisible world she had lived in for 3 years collapsed. C.O. Min-jae was no longer the untouchable titan she had watched from the periphery of the room. He stood there, the phone still clutched in a white-knuckled grip, his sharp, dark hair slightly disheveled. His intense eyes, usually cold and unreadable, were wide with a raw, jagged panic that made Jada's breath hitch in her throat. For one agonizing, frozen second, their gazes locked, the powerful Korean boss and the black maid in the Navy uniform. In that look, the hierarchy of the mansion evaporated. He didn't see a servant, and she didn't see a master. They saw two people standing on the edge of a precipice. Min-jae's mouth opened, a silent gasp escaping as he realized she had heard everything. The betrayal, the midnight deadline, the names of the men who had already sold his life. The gold rings on his fingers caught the dim light, a mocking reminder of a wealth that could no longer protect him. Jada's heart drummed a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct she had honed in the foster system told her to run, to let the fire of his world consume him while she vanished into the safety of the city streets. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw the reflection of her own terror, a shared recognition of impending doom. He was the man who had ignored her for years. Yet in this moment, he was the only other living soul in a house that had just become a tomb. You? Min-jae's voice was a ghost of itself, cracked and hollow. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The weight of the secret sat between them, a heavy, invisible chain that had just looped around both of their necks. Jada didn't shrink away. She didn't lower her head. Instead, she took a single step forward into the light of the study, her hand dropping the polishing cloth. The silence of the mansion felt heavy, pressing against the windows like a physical weight. The clock on the wall continued its rhythmic ticking, counting down the minutes to a midnight that neither of them was supposed to survive. In that silent exchange, a silent pact was sealed. The boss who was used to giving orders had no more commands to give, and the maid who was used to following them realized she was now the only one who could lead the way out. Their lives were no longer separate. They were two heartbeats tied to the same ticking clock. The silence of the mansion didn't just break. It vanished, swallowed by a sudden, jarring vacuum. At exactly 11:42 p.m., the steady hum of the climate control died, and the amber glow of the crystal chandeliers flickered once before plunging the grand hallway into an absolute, suffocating pitch. The early arrival wasn't a mistake, it was a statement. The hit squad had cut the main line, and the backup generators, Jada realized with a sinking heart, must have been sabotaged by the same lieutenants who had sold the boss's life. Min Jae's silhouette was a jagged shadow against the moonlight spilling through the high study windows. He lunged for the heavy oak desk, his hand reaching for the concealed compartment where he kept his sidearm, but his movements were heavy, hampered by the sheer weight of disbelief. The man who had orchestrated the fall of rival families was now fumbling in the dark like a novice. "The service stairs," Jada whispered, her voice cutting through the sound of his ragged breathing. She stepped fully into the room, her eyes adjusting to the silver-gray gloom. She didn't wait for his permission. She couldn't afford to. From somewhere deep in the belly of the house, the grand foyer, the muffled thump of a door being breached echoed up the vents. It was followed by the rhythmic, metallic clicking of tactical boots on marble. The hit squad was already inside. "They have thermal imaging," Min Jae hissed, finally finding his weapon. The steel slid against the leather holster with a cold, lethal hiss. "The hallways are a killing floor. There's nowhere to go. They have the blueprints to the mansion you live in," Jada countered, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached out, her fingers brushing the expensive wool of his sleeve, urging him toward the back wall. "But they don't know the house I work in. They don't know the crawl spaces behind the pantry or the laundry chutes that bypass the main security sensors." She felt him stiffen at her touch, but he didn't pull away. The hierarchy was dead. In the dark, his gold watch and charcoal suit meant nothing. Only her knowledge of the mansion's hidden arteries mattered now. Another sound drifted up, the soft, electronic chirp of a radio. They were on the second floor. Jada pressed her palm against a hidden seam in the wood paneling behind the bookshelf, a narrow door she used to avoid crossing through the study during meetings. It groaned softly, revealing a lightless, narrow passage that smelled of dust and old cedar. "Into the walls," she breathed, pulling the most feared man in the city into the dark labyrinth. Behind them, the study door kicked open with a violent crash, and the red beams of laser sights began to dance across the empty mahogany desk. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground, and the ghost was the only one who knew how to vanish. The passage behind the bookshelf was a world of raw timber and suffocating dust, a skeletal vein running through the mansion's lungs. It was never meant for someone like CEO Min Jae. The space was so narrow that his broad shoulders brushed against the rough-cut studs, the charcoal wool of his suit catching on splinters. He moved with a heavy, uncertain hitch, the weapon in his hand useless in a place where he couldn't even see his own fingers. "Wait," he hissed, his voice thick with a vulnerability that stripped away decades of authority. I can't see." Jada didn't answer with words. She reached back into the darkness, her hand finding his. When her fingers closed around his palm, She felt the tremor, the slight, rhythmic vibration of a man whose world had just imploded. His hand was large, his skin calloused and cold, but as she squeezed, he didn't pull away. He gripped her back with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a shoreline. For Min-jae, the shock was physical. For years, this woman had been a fixture, as inanimate to him as the marble statues in the foyer. He had never considered the warmth of her skin or the strength in her grip. Now, in the belly of his own fortress, the master was being led by the hand by the woman he had treated as a ghost. Every step she took was sure, her feet finding the floorboards that didn't creak, her body moving with a spatial intelligence he realized he utterly lacked. "Stay close," she breathed, her voice a feather-light vibration in the dark. "The floor lowers here. There's a drop to the service basement." She guided his hand to a cold iron pipe, using it to anchor him as they descended a hidden ladder. Min-jae followed, his senses overwhelmed by the scent of old cedar and the distant, muffled sounds of his own home being torn apart. Above them, the heavy thud of furniture being overturned echoed through the walls. He heard the muffled shouts of his lieutenants, men he had trusted, men he had shared meals with, calling out for his head. In the claustrophobic heat of the crawl space, the irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but it was the space inside those walls and the girl he had never truly seen that was currently keeping him alive. He looked at the silhouette of her head in the dim light of a vent, seeing the focus in her posture. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was a navigator in a storm he hadn't seen coming. And as they moved deeper into the shadows, the master realized that for the first time in his life, he was no longer the one in control, and he was terrifyingly grateful for it. The air in the servant passages was thick with the scent of damp concrete and lye, a sharp departure from the lavender and expensive beeswax that defined the world above. Jada moved through the dark with a fluid confidence that seemed supernatural to Min-jae. To him, this was a tomb of brick and shadow. To her, it was the map of her life. She knew exactly which floorboards to avoid to keep the silence intact, and where the ceiling dipped low enough to catch a man of his height. Min-jae followed, his hand still anchored to hers, his fingers twitching every time a muffled boom resonated through the house. Above them, the hunters were growing frustrated. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thuds of his own security team, men he had handpicked, kicking in doors and firing rounds into empty closets. They were looking for a man who moved through hallways, not a ghost who lived in the walls. "The laundry chute," Jada whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the stagnant air. "It drops straight to the industrial basement. They won't check there until they've cleared the main floors." She guided him past a series of narrow iron pipes that hissed with steam, the heat radiating off them, making the charcoal wool of his suit feel like a leaden weight. Min-jae felt a strange, jarring sense of displacement. He had lived in this mansion for 7 years, yet he realized he was a stranger in his own kingdom. He had mastered the boardrooms and the docks, but he had never known about the rusted ladder behind the kitchen pantry or the hollow space beneath the grand staircase where the cleaning supplies were kept. "How do you know all this?" he asked, the words forced out through a dry throat. Jada paused at a heavy metal hatch, the dim light of a service bulb casting a silver halo around her hair. She didn't look back, because when you're invisible, Mr. CEO, you learn how to find the places where no one looks. You see the things people think don't matter. She pulled the lever, and the hatch groaned open to reveal a vertical shaft. The darkness below was absolute. Min-jae looked at the small opening, then back at the girl who had spent her years polishing his vanity and erasing his footprints. He saw the smudge of soot on her cheek and the fierce, quiet intelligence in her eyes. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the weight of his gold watch felt like a shackle, while her simple navy uniform looked like armor. "Trust me," she said, her voice steady even as the sound of boots echoed directly overhead. Without waiting for an answer, she stepped into the void, and for the first time in his life, the boss followed someone else into the dark. The industrial basement was a tomb of damp concrete and low-hanging pipes, lit only by the rhythmic, red pulse of the emergency strobes. They crouched behind a wall of heavy oak wine crates, the air smelling of vintage grapes and the metallic tang of old copper. Above them, the mansion groaned as the hit squad systematically dismantled Minjae's world, their heavy footfalls vibrating through the ceiling like distant thunder. For the first time since the lights went out, the adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by a heavy, suffocating reality. Minjae leaned his head back against the cold stone wall, his charcoal suit jacket torn and stained with the dust of the service tunnels. He looked at his hands. The gold rings were scuffed, his skin smeared with the grime of the places he had never bothered to look at. Then, he looked at Jada. She was checking the seal on a heavy iron door, her navy uniform damp with sweat, her posture alert. She didn't look like a ghost anymore. She looked like a sentinel. What? Minjae's voice was a low rasp, barely audible over the hum of the distant boiler. You heard the call. You knew the hit squad was elite. You knew that staying with me was a death sentence. Jada didn't turn around immediately. She kept her eyes on the shadows of the stairs. You're a billionaire, Minjae, he continued, the use of his name without a title sounding strange in the hollow room. You've seen how people in this house treat me. My own men, people I've fed and protected for a decade, are upstairs right now, waiting to put a bullet in my brain for a bigger paycheck. You could have walked out the back gate and been home before the first shot was fired. So tell me, why did you take my hand? Jada finally turned, her dark eyes reflecting the rhythmic red glow of the emergency light. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet, devastating clarity. Because I've spent my whole life being tossed away by people who thought I didn't matter, she said, her voice steady and soft. I grew up in a system that taught me that life is cheap and loyalty is a lie. If I had walked out that door and left you to die just because it was easy, I would have been exactly like the people who broke me. I didn't save you because you're a boss or because you're powerful. She took a step closer, her silhouette small but immovable against the backdrop of his crumbling empire. I saved you because I'm the only one in this house who actually knows what it's like to be invisible. And I refuse to let another soul be erased while I'm standing right there. You might be a monster to the rest of the world, but tonight, you're just a person who was betrayed. And where I come from, we don't leave people behind. Minjae stared at her, the silence between them deepening. In the high-stakes world of the Mafia, he had bought loyalty, traded for it, and killed for it, but he had never actually seen it, not like this. Not a loyalty that asked for nothing and offered everything. For the first time in 50 years, the most feared man in the city felt small. He realized that while he had been building an empire of stone and blood, Jada Whitmore had been building one of character. And as the boots of the assassins finally hit the basement floor, Minjae realized he wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting to be worthy of the woman who had refused to let him go. The heavy basement door groaned on its hinges as the first of the hit squad stepped into the concrete vault. The beam of a high-powered tactical light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust and the rows of heavy wine crates. From her position high above on a narrow maintenance catwalk, Jada watched the red laser sights dance across the floor like hungry insects. Beside her, Minjae gripped his weapon, his jaw set in a hard line, but Jada placed a grounding hand on his shoulder. Wait, she breathed, her voice a mere vibration. Let them chase the ghost. She reached into the utility belt she had worn for 3 years, a belt usually filled with glass cleaner and microfiber cloths, and pulled out a heavy canister of industrial floor wax and a bundle of high-tensile wire she'd pulled from the laundry room. To the assassins, This was a basement. To Jada, it was a stage she had prepared 1,000 times. She dropped a glass bottle of ammonia into the ventilation intake. Within seconds, the sharp, stinging chemical cloud billowed out at floor level, masking their scents and forcing the mercenaries to cough and adjust their masks. As they faltered, Jada yanked the wire. A heavy rack of empty crates, rigged earlier, collapsed with a thunderous crash in the far corner of the room. The hit squad swiveled, their suppressed rifles spitting silent sparks of lead into the wood. While they were distracted, Jada poured the slick, clear wax over the iron stairs behind them. When the lead assassin moved to reposition, his boots hit the invisible lubricant. He went down with a sickening crack, sliding into the darkness of the lower sump pump. "Now," Min-jae whispered, his eyes wide as he watched the invisible girl dismantle an elite unit using nothing but the tools of her servitude. "Not yet," she replied, her eyes tracking the remaining two. She knew the exact timing of the emergency strobes. As the red light pulsed off, she hurled a bucket of industrial-grade degreaser toward the electrical panel. The liquid hissed against the live wires, triggering a blinding arc of blue sparks that acted like a flashbang in the enclosed space. In the chaos of white light and chemical smoke, the assassins were blind, their high-tech sensors overloaded by the static. Jada didn't need high-tech gear. She knew the distance between the crates by heart. She knew how many steps it took to reach the heavy steel bulkhead. "The mouse knows the holes in the wall, Mr. CEO," she whispered, her voice cold and steady. "And tonight, the cats are playing in the dark." She signaled him forward. As they slipped through the bulkhead into the service elevator, Jada looked back one last time. The men who had come to erase an empire were stumbling over mops and slipping on wax, defeated by the very things they had never bothered to notice. The mansion had frozen, but in the heat of the basement, the power had finally shifted hands. The service elevator opened directly into the private corridor of the executive wing. The air here still smelling of expensive sandalwood and the faint, lingering ozone of the earlier electrical surge. Jada stepped out first, her navy uniform torn at the shoulder, her breathing rhythmic and shallow. Min-jae followed, his movements no longer hesitant. He held his weapon with the practiced grace of a predator, but his eyes never left the back of the woman who had guided him through the dark. They reached the heavy oak doors of the study, the place where the world had first fractured. The doors were splintered, hanging off their hinges where the hit squad had breached them hours before. Inside, the grand executive desk stood like an altar in the moonlight. Sitting in Min-jae's high-back leather chair was Barrett, his most trusted lieutenant, casually turning the gold signet ring he had stolen from the desk drawer. "You should have stayed in the walls, Min-jae," Barrett said, his voice smooth and devoid of remorse. He didn't look up as two hidden gunmen stepped out from the shadows of the silk curtains, their red laser sights snapping onto Min-jae's chest. It would have been a quicker death. Now, I have to wonder how a ghost managed to lead a blind man through a fortress. Min-jae didn't flinch. He looked at the man he had called a brother, then at the girl standing beside him. "I wasn't blind, Barrett," Min-jae said, his voice sounding like grinding stone. "I was just looking at the wrong people." Barrett laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "And what is she? A witness? A shield?" He gestured to Jada. "She's a maid, Min-jae. She's nothing. She's the only one in this room who knows the true weight of this house," Jada said, her voice cutting through the tension. Her hand was steady as she reached for the small, innocuous control panel hidden under the lip of the mahogany doorframe, a panel she had polished every day for 3 years. With a decisive click, the mansion's primary failsafe, the one the traitors thought they had deactivated, engaged. A heavy, reinforced steel shutter slammed down over the study door, sealing them in, and the floor plates beneath the gunman retracted by a mere 6 inches. It was a subtle shift, but in the high-stakes silence, It was enough to throw their aim off by a mile. As the gunman stumbled, Min-jae moved. The room erupted in a blur of motion and suppressed gunfire. He didn't fight like a boss giving orders. He fought like a man protecting the foundation of his home. Within seconds, the traitors were disarmed and neutralized, leaving Barrett trembling in the chair he hadn't earned. Min-jae walked toward the executive desk, but he didn't sit down. He looked at the chaos, then back at Jada, who was standing by the door, her hand still on the switch. The invisible girl had turned his sanctuary into a trap and his defeat into a victory. The secret that had frozen the mansion was no longer his burden alone. It was the fire that had finally burned the traitors out of his life. The Seattle sun rose, thin and pale, casting long, geometric shadows across the study that had nearly become a graveyard. The shattered glass had been cleared, and the scent of gunpowder had been replaced by the sharp, clean aroma of fresh espresso and the familiar sandalwood that defined Seo Min-jae's presence. But the mansion was different. The heavy, oppressive silence that usually demanded perfection had shifted into something else, a quiet that felt like a held breath, waiting for a new rhythm to begin. Min-jae sat behind his grand mahogany desk, his charcoal suit fresh, his dark hair perfectly slicked back once more. To anyone walking in, he looked like the same titan who had ruled the city with an iron fist. But as he looked down at his gold signet ring, now returned to his finger, his hand lacked its usual tremor of cold calculation. He looked up as the heavy oak doors opened. Jada walked in, but she wasn't carrying a polishing cloth or a tray of silver. She wore a simple, elegant dress of deep navy, her hair no longer pulled back in a practical bun, but falling softly around her shoulders. She didn't pause at the threshold, and she didn't lower her eyes. She walked with the measured, confident stride of someone who had navigated the belly of a beast and come out the other side. Min-jae stood as she approached, a gesture of respect he had never offered anyone in this house. He didn't speak. He simply gestured to the leather armchair directly across from him. Jada sat. The chair was soft, the position unfamiliar, but she occupied the space with a quiet gravity that made the room feel balanced for the first time in years. For 3 years, she had scrubbed the floorboards beneath this desk, invisible and unheard. Now, she sat at eye level with the man who owned the empire. The lieutenants have been dealt with, Min-jae said, his voice steady but lacking its former bite. The organization is being rebuilt from the ground up. But I realized this morning that a house is only as strong as its foundation. And I've spent my life ignoring the very people who hold it together. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. I don't want a ghost in this mansion, Jada. I need a conscience. I need the person who stayed when the world turned cold. Jada looked at him, seeing the man behind the boss, the person she had saved in the dark. She didn't need the luxury or the gold, but she saw the opportunity to change the nature of the silence in the halls. I'm not here to blend into the walls anymore, she said firmly. Min-jae nodded, a small, genuine ghost of a smile touching his lips. I know. From today, the order of this house changes. You aren't cleaning the mansion, Jada. You're helping me run it. Outside, the mansion began to hum again, but the gears were different now. The invisible girl had become the heart of the empire, and the boss had finally learned that true power doesn't come from being feared. It comes from being worth saving. The story of Jada Whitmore and Seo Min-jae serves as a timeless testament to the enduring power of character over rank. In the high-walled world of the elite, it is easy to mistake wealth for security and a title for strength. Yet when the lights went out and the bullets began to fly, it wasn't the mafia boss's gold or his charcoal suits that saved him. It was the invisible girl who understood the foundations of the house better than the man who owned it. True power, as Jada demonstrated, is not found in a grand executive desk or a gold signet ring. It is found in the quiet, radical integrity of a person who refuses to let their light be extinguished by the darkness of their surroundings. Jada had every reason to walk away, to let the man who had ignored her for years face the consequences of his own world. But her decision to save a monster was not about him. It was about her. It was about the refusal to become like those who had tried to break her. In choosing mercy, she didn't just save Min Jae's life. She humanized him, forcing a Titan to realize that his empire was built on the backs of people he had never truly seen. The lesson left behind in the silent hallways of the CO mansion is clear. The most important people in any room are often the ones we overlook. They're the ones who see the cracks in the walls, the ones who know the secrets of the crawl spaces, and the ones who carry the moral weight when the pillars of power begin to crumble. This story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act when everyone else is frozen by it. It teaches us that our value is not determined by the uniform we wear or the floors we scrub, but by the strength of our character under pressure. As the mansion settles into its new order, we are left with the profound truth that loyalty cannot be bought, and respect is earned not through fear, but through the courage to stand for what is right. If this journey moved you, remember that your voice matters, even in the loudest rooms. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next tale, where we explore how a single debt can change the course of a lifetime. Good night, and remember, never underestimate the power of the unseen.